It started on a Tuesday, a day as unremarkable as any other. I had just finished up at school, and the usual routine unfolded: a walk home through the quiet suburban streets, the rustle of leaves underfoot, and the distant hum of a lawnmower. I remember feeling a strange sense of unease, but I shrugged it off as just another case of teenage paranoia. Home was the same, a small, two-story house on Elm Street. My parents were still at work, and the house was silent save for the low hum of the refrigerator. I tossed my backpack onto the couch and made my way to the kitchen to grab a snack. That's when the phone rang. I glanced at the old landline on the counter, a relic my parents insisted on keeping. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. Hesitant, I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice echoing in the empty kitchen. There was a pause, a crackle of static, and then a voice, low, almost whispering, but unmistakably clear. "I saw you today." A chill ran down my spine. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The voice ignored my question. "You were wearing a blue hoodie. You took the long way home. Why?" My heart raced. The details were too specific to be a prank. My eyes darted around the kitchen, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. "Who are you?" I asked again, anger masking my fear. Another pause. "I'm closer than you think." I slammed the phone down, the plastic receiver clattering against the base. My hands trembled as I backed away, scanning the room for any sign of an intruder. But everything was normal. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the tiled floor. I tried to shake off the encounter, convincing myself it was just some sick joke. I turned on the TV, hoping the familiar sounds of my favorite show would drown out my unease. But as the hours passed, the memory of that voice lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A new message from an unknown number. "Did you sleep well?" I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. How did they know? How could they possibly know? I typed back a frantic reply, my fingers shaking. "Who are you?" The response was immediate. "Someone who's always watching." I felt a scream rising in my throat, but I swallowed it down, glancing around my darkened room. The shadows seemed to shift and grow, every creak of the house magnified in the silence. For the first time in my life, I felt truly terrified. The kind of fear that wraps around your heart and squeezes, leaving you breathless and trembling. I knew then that this was just the beginning, and that whoever, or whatever, was on the other end of that phone, they weren't going to stop. Not until they had me exactly where they wanted me. The following morning, I woke up groggy and unrested, the events of the previous day weighing heavily on my mind. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow darker than usual. As I prepared for school, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The walk to school was tense. Every person I passed, every car that drove by, felt like a potential threat. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the streets were as empty as ever. When I arrived at school, my best friend, Lisa, noticed my unease immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her brow furrowed with concern. I hesitated, then told her about the phone call and the creepy message I'd received. Lisa's eyes widened, and she glanced around nervously. "That's seriously messed up," she whispered. "Are you going to tell your parents?" I shook my head. "Not yet. I don't want to freak them out unless I have to. It's probably just a prank." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The day dragged on. I couldn't concentrate in class, my mind constantly drifting back to the unknown caller. By the time the final bell rang, I was a bundle of nerves. The walk home was no better. Every rustling leaf, every distant laugh, sent my heart racing. When I finally reached my house, I breathed a sigh of relief. But that relief was short-lived. As I stepped inside, the phone rang. The sound sent a jolt of fear through me. I forced myself to walk over and pick up the receiver. "Hello?" The same voice, cold and mocking, greeted me. "Did you enjoy school today?" I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "I want to play a game," the voice replied. "Let's see how well you know your own house." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, my mind racing. What game? What were they talking about? I was about to hang up when my phone buzzed with a new message. It was a picture, taken from inside my house. It showed my living room, the TV still on from the night before. My blood ran cold. I spun around, my eyes scanning the room. It was empty, just as I'd left it. But the photo had been taken recently, very recently. I grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly made my way through the house, checking every room, every closet. But there was no one there. No sign of an intruder. When I returned to the living room, my phone buzzed again. Another message. You missed a spot. My heart pounded as I looked around. Missed a spot? What did they mean? Then it hit me. The attic. I'd forgotten about the attic. We never used it, and the entrance was hidden in the hallway ceiling. I grabbed a chair and pulled down the ladder, my hands shaking. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old boxes and forgotten memories. I shone my phone's flashlight around, searching for any sign of the caller. And then I saw it. In the corner, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a small, old-fashioned tape recorder. I approached it cautiously, my knife at the ready. The recorder had a single tape inside, labeled simply "Play Me." With trembling hands, I pressed the play button. The recorder whirred to life, and the same cold voice filled the attic. Welcome to the game. If you're hearing this, you've made it to the first level. Congratulations. But this is only the beginning. There are many more levels to go, and each one will be harder than the last. If you want to survive, you'll have to be smart. Very smart. The tape clicked off, and I stood there in the darkness, my heart pounding. This was no prank. This was a nightmare come to life. And I had no idea how to stop it. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. Lisa and I stuck together, attending school and trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the fear gnawed at us constantly. The police had found no evidence of an intruder at either of our houses, which only made things worse. It was as if our tormentor was a ghost, slipping in and out without a trace. One evening, while we were at Lisa's aunt's house, we received a visitor. Detective Marshall, a grizzled veteran with a stern face, had taken an interest in our case. He sat us down in the living room, his presence both reassuring and intimidating. I've been assigned to look into these incidents, he said, flipping open a worn notebook. I need you to tell me everything from the beginning. We recounted the story, the phone calls, the messages, the tape recorders. Detective Marshall listened intently, his eyes narrowing with every detail. When did you first start receiving these calls? He asked, jotting down notes. About a week ago, I replied, glancing at Lisa for confirmation. He nodded. And there have been no signs of forced entry at either of your homes? None, Lisa confirmed. It's like they just appear out of nowhere. Detective Marshall leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Whoever this is, they're going to great lengths to scare you. But they're also leaving clues. Tape recorders aren't exactly easy to come by these days. He stood up, his expression serious. I'm going to station a patrol car outside this house tonight. If anything happens, call me immediately. We thanked him, feeling a small measure of relief. But as the night wore on, my anxiety returned. I couldn't help but feel that we were missing something, some crucial piece of the puzzle. Around midnight, Lisa and I were sitting in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with a movie. The tension was palpable, every noise making us jump. Then, it happened again. My phone buzzed with a new message. Dread pooled in my stomach as I looked at the screen. Check under the bed. Lisa and I exchanged terrified glances. She grabbed a baseball bat from her closet, and I slowly approached the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I knelt down, using my phone's flashlight to peer underneath. At first, I saw nothing but dust bunnies and an old shoe. But then I spotted it, another tape recorder, just like the one in my attic. My hands trembled as I pulled it out and pressed play. The voice, now familiar and terrifying, spoke again. Level 2. You're not alone. The tape ended abruptly, and the silence was deafening. Lisa and I looked around the room, panic rising. We need to get out of here, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We grabbed our things and bolted from the house, heading to the nearest police station. The night air was cold, and every shadow seemed to move. My paranoia was at an all-time high, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. At the station, we told the officer on duty everything. He took our statement seriously, though I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He promised to send someone to check our houses and advised us to stay with family or friends until they figured things out. Lisa and I decided to stay at her aunt's house, just a few miles away. It felt safer to be with more people around. As we settled in for the night, my phone buzzed once more. I hesitated, fear gripping me, but I knew I had to see it. The message was simple but chilling. Nowhere is safe. I showed it to Lisa, and we both sat in stunned silence. This wasn't going to stop. Whoever was doing this had thought of everything, and they were always one step ahead. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every window felt like a portal for unseen eyes, every corner a hiding place for horrors. The game had only just begun, and I was starting to realize that escaping it might be impossible. The following days were a whirlwind of police activity and mounting dread. Detective Marshall kept us updated, but there were no breakthroughs. The shadowy figure had vanished without a trace, leaving us with more questions than answers. One evening, just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard, my phone buzzed again. The unknown number. My heart sank as I opened the message. "Look inside." I showed the message to Lisa, and we both stared at the dilapidated house. It was a place we had always avoided, rumored to be haunted or worse. Now, it seemed like our only choice. "We have to go in," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Lisa nodded, her face pale. "Let's get it over with." We approached the house cautiously, the wooden porch creaking under our feet. The front door was slightly ajar, and with a deep breath, we pushed it open. The interior was dark and musty, filled with the scent of decay and neglect. Using our phone flashlights, we made our way through the house. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant drip of water set our nerves on edge. We searched room by room, finding nothing but dust and broken furniture. Then, in the living room, we found it. Another tape recorder, placed on a rotting coffee table. My hand shook as I pressed play. Level 3. The past never stays buried. The voice sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at Lisa, who looked as terrified as I felt. What did it mean? The past never stays buried? Before we could ponder the message further, my phone buzzed again. Dig deep. We exchanged confused looks. Dig deep? In the house? We started searching the living room more thoroughly, checking under furniture and in every nook and cranny. Finally, Lisa found a loose floorboard. Together, we pried it up, revealing a small, dirt-covered box. My heart pounded as I opened the box. Inside was an old, faded photograph. It showed a young girl, no older than 10, standing in front of the very house we were in. Her eyes were haunting, her expression somber. There was a note with a photograph. I unfolded it with trembling hands. "She's still here." A sense of dread washed over me. What did this mean? Was the girl connected to our tormentor somehow? Was she a victim, or something worse? We decided to leave the house and return to the safety of Lisa's aunt's place. But as we stepped outside, my phone buzzed once more. Too late. I looked up, and my blood turned to ice. The patrol car was gone, and standing in its place was the hooded figure, his knife gleaming in the fading light. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Lisa's hand. We sprinted down the street, the hooded figure close behind. My heart pounded in my chest, fear giving me the strength to keep going. We turned a corner and almost collided with Detective Marshall, who had just arrived in his car. He took one look at our faces and drew his gun, turning to face the approaching figure. "Freeze!" he shouted. The hooded figure stopped, his face still hidden in the shadows. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the figure turned and fled into the night, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Detective Marshall called for backup, and soon the area was swarming with police. They searched the neighborhood but found no trace of the intruder. It was as if he had vanished into thin air once again. Back at Lisa's aunt's house, Detective Marshall sat us down, his expression grave. "This is escalating," he said. "Whoever this is, they're getting bolder. We need to find them before it's too late." I nodded, my mind reeling. The photograph, the note, the messages, it all had to mean something. We just had to figure out what. And we had to do it before it was too late. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. The game was getting more dangerous, and the stakes were higher than ever. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to let this shadowy figure control my life. I was going to fight back, no matter what it took. The night after our encounter with the hooded figure was restless. Sleep was an elusive dream, replaced by the constant vigilance of waiting for the next move. Detective Marshall had arranged for increased patrols in our neighborhood, but the fear gnawed at us constantly. The next morning, Lisa and I decided to do some investigating of our own. We needed to uncover the mystery behind the photograph of the young girl. Armed with our phones and a determination to find answers, we headed to the local library to dig into the history of the abandoned house. The library was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos in our minds. We scoured old newspapers and public records, piecing together a story that seemed to have been forgotten by time. It turned out that the house had belonged to the Johnson family, who had lived there in the late 1980s. They had a daughter, Emily, who went missing one summer. The case had gone cold, and the family eventually moved away, leaving the house to decay. As we read through the old articles, a sense of unease settled over us. Emily's disappearance had never been solved, and there were no leads, no suspects. She had simply vanished. We returned to Lisa's aunt's house with more questions than answers. Detective Marshall was waiting for us, his face lined with concern. "What did you find?" he asked. I handed him the photograph of Emily. She lived in the house where we found the tape recorder. She went missing years ago. Marshall studied the photograph, his expression darkening. This might be more complicated than we thought. That evening, as we were preparing for bed, my phone buzzed again. The unknown number. My heart sank as I read the message. "Do you want to know what happened to Emily?" Lisa and I exchanged horrified glances. I quickly typed back a response. "Yes." The reply came almost instantly. "Meet me at the old house. Alone." Fear gripped me, but I knew this might be our only chance to get answers. Lisa protested, but I convinced her that it was the only way. I grabbed my phone, a flashlight, and the knife I had been carrying since the beginning of this nightmare. The walk to the abandoned house was nerve-wracking. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound made me jump. When I arrived, the house loomed over me, a silent sentinel in the night. I stepped inside, the musty air and creaking floorboards sending shivers down my spine. The house was dark, and my flashlight barely penetrated the shadows. I moved cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. In the living room, I found another tape recorder. This one was different, it had a video screen. With trembling hands, I pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy, old video. Emily's face appeared, her eyes wide with fear. She was in the same room I was standing in, looking directly at the camera. "He's here," she whispered. "He's always here." The video cut to static, and then the same cold voice spoke. "Emily tried to escape. She failed. Will you?" I felt a wave of terror. The realization hit me like a truck. This wasn't just a game. This was a reenactment of Emily's final moments, and I was the next victim. Before I could react, the front door slammed shut. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The hooded figure stood in the doorway, his knife glinting in the dim light. "Stay away!" I screamed, backing up against the wall. The figure stepped closer, the knife raised. My mind raced, searching for a way out. I remembered the loose floorboard in the living room and the small crawl space beneath it. I bolted towards the spot, yanking the board up and squeezing into the cramped space. The hooded figure slashed at the air where I had been moments before, his knife clanging against the wooden floor. I crawled through the darkness, my heart pounding in my ears. The space was tight, and I could barely move, but I kept going. I heard the figure above me, his footsteps echoing through the house. Finally, I emerged in the basement. It was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of mold. I searched frantically for an exit, my flashlight beam dancing across the walls. Then, I saw it. A small, barred window near the ceiling. I climbed up, using the old pipes for support, and managed to pry the bars loose. I squeezed through the opening, scraping my arms and legs in the process, and dropped to the ground outside. I didn't stop running until I reached Lisa's aunt's house. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, tears streaming down my face. Lisa and Detective Marshall were waiting for me, their expressions a mix of relief and horror. "He's still out there," I panted. "And he won't stop." Detective Marshall grabbed his phone, calling for backup. I collapsed onto the couch, my body shaking with fear and exhaustion. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hooded figure was still out there, and the game was far from finished. But now, we had a name. Emily. And with that, a glimmer of hope that we could end this nightmare once and for all. The weight of the final message hung over us like a dark cloud. "You're next." It was a chilling reminder that the hooded figure wasn't finished. Detective Marshall and his team worked tirelessly, setting up surveillance around Lisa's aunt's house and combing through the evidence we had gathered. But despite their efforts, the sense of impending doom was impossible to shake. A week passed without any incidents. It was almost worse than the constant fear we had grown accustomed to. The quiet felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. We knew it was only a matter of time before the hooded figure made his next move. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, my phone buzzed again. The unknown number. My hands shook as I opened the message. Meet me where it all began. Alone. Attached was a map leading to the abandoned house where we had found the first tape recorder. I showed the message to Detective Marshall, who insisted on coming with me. We agreed on a plan. I would go inside while the police surrounded the area, ready to move in at a moment's notice. As I approached the house, the familiar dread washed over me. The creaking porch, the broken windows, the sense of decay, it all felt like a nightmare come to life. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The house was silent, the air thick with anticipation. I moved through the rooms cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. In the living room, where we had found the first tape recorder, I saw him. The hooded figure stood in the center of the room, his back to me. He was holding something in his hands, but I couldn't see what it was. I'm here, I said, my voice echoing in the silence. What do you want? He turned slowly, his face still hidden in the shadows. I want to finish the game, he said, his voice cold and emotionless. But first, you need to understand. He stepped closer, and I saw what he was holding, a photo album. He handed it to me, and I opened it with trembling hands. The album was filled with pictures of Emily, each one more disturbing than the last. Her fear, her pain, her final moments, it was all documented in horrifying detail. This is what happens when you don't follow the rules, he said, his voice growing more menacing. But you've done well. You've played the game perfectly. Now, it's time for the final level. Before I could react, he lunged at me, the knife gleaming in the dim light. I dodged to the side, my flashlight clattering to the floor. We struggled, his strength surprising me. But I fought back with everything I had, my fear giving way to a surge of adrenaline. In the chaos, I managed to grab the knife from his hand and swung it wildly. The blade connected, and he staggered back, clutching his side. The room filled with the sound of approaching footsteps as Detective Marshall and his team stormed the house. The hooded figure fell to the ground, blood pooling around him. I stood there, panting, my hands shaking. Detective Marshall grabbed me, pulling me away from the scene. It's over, he said, his voice firm but gentle. You're safe now. The hooded figure was arrested and taken into custody. His real name was Robert Stevens, a man with a history of mental illness and a twisted obsession with recreating the trauma of his own childhood. Emily had been his first victim, and I was supposed to be his last. As the weeks passed, the fear slowly began to dissipate. Lisa and I returned to our lives, though the scars of what we had endured would never fully heal. Detective Marshall kept in touch, ensuring we had the support we needed to move forward. One evening, as I was sitting in my room, my phone buzzed. My heart skipped a beat, but when I checked the message, it was from Lisa. Hey, just wanted to check in. How are you holding up? I smiled, grateful for the reminder that I wasn't alone. I replied, and we chatted for a while, the conversation light and comforting. As I put my phone down, I glanced at the clock. It was late, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. The nightmare was over, and we had survived. The game was finished, and we had won. But as I turned off the light and settled into bed, a thought lingered in the back of my mind. The hooded figure was behind bars, but the memory of his voice, his cold, calculating gaze, would stay with me forever. I knew that no matter how much time passed, the echoes of the game would always be there, a reminder of the darkness that lurks in the shadows. And as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder, was it truly over? Or was this just the beginning of another game, waiting to be played?